First, we're going to talk about the impact that so-called forever chemicals can have on your health and the environment. They can be found on all kinds of everyday objects, but there are now plans to try and tackle the problem. Well, Dr. Zhang.
The action plan has just kicked the can down the road and has basically focused on controlling emissions and collecting more data, all of which are very important steps, but unfortunately they don't really solve the problem, which is controlling the pollution at the very source. So it's like if you do not turn off the tap, it's like mopping the floor while the tap is still switched on. So there is no point in collecting more data and collecting more evidence unless you stop their manufacturing and use at the very source.
Do you think that the government, though, with what it said, is casting its net far enough, wide enough? Is there anything you'd like to see differently?
No, I don't think it's casting its net wide enough. Like I said earlier, it's really important to do more testing and it's really important to do more monitoring and find out where exactly these harmful chemicals are present in our environment. However, if we just focus on doing more testing and doing more research, then we are not really solving the problem. What we need now is urgent action. The public has lost faith in the chemical industry because of all the pollution scandals. And so it's the government's duty to bring in strict regulations and protect its citizens against exposure to these harmful chemicals.
One of the government's actions in the plan is to publish a response to a consultation to add more PFAS to the UK Pollutant Release and Transfer Register. I just wondered, Shubi, what type of chemicals you would like to see on that list?
I don't think that's the real question here. The question is, even if the government puts a list of this and this PFAS is in the environment, what is it exactly that the consumers can do about this list? It's not like if they know that this PFAS is in the environment, this list is not going to protect them against exposure to these PFAS chemicals. So again, going back to the point that I've been trying to make over and over again, which is the PFAS, they need to be stopped at the source. No kind of list or no kind of information is going to prevent consumers and the general public from being exposed to these chemicals. And the burden should not lie on the consumers. It's really inappropriate for the government to really expect the citizens to make these kinds of decisions and to make these kinds of choices when the real accountability lies with the government and with the polluters who have caused this PFAS pollution disaster in the first place.
And yet, all too often, it seems it requires a journalistic investigation or citizen science to sort of expose these big problems and big industry figures. Pippa, we talked about God's Own Dark Waters. For listeners who didn't hear that series, that was about the town in Bentham that you investigated and found out and discovered potentially it being the UK's most PFAS polluted town in the country. There's another site that you've been looking at recently. We have discussed it, Thornton Cleveleys. That's back on your radar. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
According to the Environment Agency, there's thousands of potential PFAS polluted sites across the country. So as Shubi's kind of alluding to, like, we have lots of information about this. And of course, like, it's great to be gathering more data. Of course, we always should be doing that. But I do think hiding behind that as a reason not to take action is hard to hear because there is so much data. We know that there's thousands of polluted sites across the country. And yeah, Thornton Cleveleys is one of these sites. So in Thornton Cleveleys, there's a PFAS manufacturing factory called AGC Chemicals, and historic emissions at part of the site of PFOA, which is one of these PFAS chemicals, which kind of has the most research on. And so it's considered a class 1 carcinogenic chemical, was emitted from the site in extremely large quantities over many years. This stopped in 2012, which is important to say, but this historic release of PFOA is a huge problem in the area. And as a result, the Environment Agency and the local council are conducting a contaminated land investigation. And as part of that, I reported this week that testing of eggs, so from ducks or chickens that are reared in the kind of immediate vicinity of the factory, have been tested by the local authority. And one woman got in touch with me to share that test data with me, and it's extremely alarming to see just how contaminated these eggs are. So the data shows that if she ate just one of these eggs a week, she would exceed the kind of threshold in the EU of what's a safe, quote, level of PFAS to be consuming. And this lady told me that she now feels terrified to go in her garden and that she says she stopped eating these eggs from her ducks when this contaminated land investigation started, just out of like a precautionary approach that she took on herself. But before that, she's been eating these eggs basically every single day for decades, and so have her 5 children. So she's obviously now extremely worried about the potential health impacts on her and, you know, whether she has high levels of PFAS in her blood. So given that that's what's at stake when it comes to PFAS pollution, this quest for more information, while obviously is really important in this, regulation is really important too, given that we are talking about people's lives, and the idea of someone saying they feel frightened to go in their garden and they wish they could move house but they can't afford to, they feel trapped. You know,
Yes.
It doesn't really get much worse than that for me.
Shubi, we've been talking there about the real world impacts of people having to live near, ingest, inhale these chemicals for decades in the case of AGC and the people living around that plant.
PFAS are chemicals which bioaccumulate. So the levels are just going to keep increasing in the environment, and no amount of testing, no amount of putting PFAS on the list for consumers to know is going to stop them from entering people's bodies. So what really are we doing here if we don't have any concrete plans to stop this pollution from entering into the environment in the first place?
So what do we do?
What I can say is that the EU has been a shining light in terms of how PFAS can be regulated. They have brought in a protective regulation which proposes to phase out all 10,000 PFAS at the very source. And then there are countries like Denmark and France which have not waited for the EU's universal PFAS restriction to come into place, because we know that is only going to come into effect at the end of this decade. So they're not waiting to protect their citizens. They're already going ahead and they're phasing out PFAS from various uses such as textiles, from clothing, from footwear, where we know that there are PFAS alternatives available, and they choose to provide protection to their citizens now, today. And so that's the bare minimum that the UK can do, is to follow in the footsteps of Denmark and France while we wait for the big EU's universal PFAS restriction to come into place.